What if the most powerful breakup is the one that makes no sound at all? No final message, no argument, no goodbye, just a quiet shift you don't even notice at first. One day, they're reacting, explaining, trying. And the next, it's like something inside them has completely shut off. This is what happens when an empath reaches their limit, not with drama, but with silence. And for a narcissist, that silence is more terrifying than any words you could ever say. Because now there's nothing to control, nothing to twist, nothing to pull back. In this video, you'll see why the silent discard hits harder than rejection, why it creates obsession instead of closure, and why the person who once chased you ends up losing themselves trying to understand you. But here's the part most people don't realize, and it changes everything. Stay with me till the end, because once you see this pattern, you'll never look at silence the same way again. And if you've ever experienced this kind of shift, don't just watch quietly, leave a silent in the comments. And subscribe if you're ready to understand the kind of power most people never learn to use. There's a moment in every toxic dynamic that almost no one talks about, because on the surface, nothing has actually happened yet. No breakup, no confrontation, no dramatic exit. Everything looks the same from the outside. You're still there, still responding, still playing your role. But internally, something has shifted. And that shift is the real beginning of the end. This is the moment an empath starts to detach, not physically, but emotionally. It doesn't come from anger or revenge. It comes from exhaustion, from realizing that no matter how much you give, explain, or try to fix things, the cycle never changes. And the most unsettling part is that this change is quiet. There's no announcement, no warning, just a slow, almost invisible withdrawal of energy. And somehow the narcissist feels it. They can't explain it, and they definitely can't control it, but they sense that something is off. The reactions they once relied on start to fade. The emotional intensity they used to provoke isn't there anymore. The conversations feel different, flatter, less engaging. It's like they're reaching for something that used to be within their grasp, but now it's just out of reach. And this is where the tension begins to build, because for the first time, they're not sure what's happening. They may try to test you, pushing your buttons in subtle ways, waiting for the usual response, but it doesn't come, at least not in the way it used to. And that uncertainty starts to bother them more than any argument ever could. What makes this moment so powerful is that it's not loud or obvious. You're not fighting back. You're not trying to win, and you're not even trying to make them understand you anymore. In fact, you've stopped trying altogether, and that's exactly what changes the dynamic. Because a narcissist thrives on emotional engagement, whether it's love, anger, frustration, or pain. As long as you're reacting, they feel in control. But when your energy shifts, when your responses become minimal, calm, or even indifferent, it disrupts everything they've built. It creates a kind of psychological tension they're not used to handling. They didn't lose you yet, but they can feel it coming. That's the unsettling truth of this stage. You're still physically present, but emotionally, you're already creating distance. And that distance is something they can't measure or manipulate. It's not something they can argue against or twist in their favor. It just exists, quietly growing stronger with every moment you choose not to react the way you used to. And the more this happens, the more they start to feel a loss they can't fully understand. At this point, they may become more attentive, more curious, even slightly anxious. They might ask questions, try to pull you back into old patterns, or suddenly act differently in an attempt to regain control. But what they don't realize is that this shift isn't temporary. It's not a mood, and it's not a phase. It's the result of a deeper realization, one that has already started to change how you see them, and more importantly, how you see yourself. You're no longer looking for validation in the same place. You're no longer trying to fix what was never yours to fix. And that's why this moment matters so much, because this is where the power dynamic quietly begins to reverse. not through force, not through confrontation, but through absence. The absence of reaction, the absence of emotional supply, the absence of the version of you they were used to controlling. It's subtle, but it's undeniable. And even if they can't put it into words, they feel it. That creeping sense that something is slipping through their fingers, something they once had full access to, but now can't quite reach. This is the beginning of the silent discard, not the part people see, but the part that changes everything. The internal decision, the emotional withdrawal, the quiet realization that you're done, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. And from this moment on, even if nothing has officially ended yet, the connection is no longer the same. Because once an empath detaches on the inside, the rest is only a matter of time. There comes a point in this dynamic where words lose their power, not because there's nothing left to say, but because you finally understand that saying more will change nothing. This is where silence enters, not as weakness, not as avoidance, but as a deliberate shift in how you respond. Narcissists are deeply dependent on reaction. It doesn't matter whether that reaction is positive or negative, what matters is that it exists. Anger, love, frustration, long explanations, emotional outbursts, all of it feeds the same need for control. As long as you are engaging, as long as you are explaining yourself, defending your intentions, or trying to be understood, they remain in a position of power. They can twist your words, redirect the conversation, create confusion, and keep you emotionally invested in a cycle that never really resolves. But silence disrupts all of that in a way nothing else can. Silence is different because it offers no entry point. There's nothing to grab onto, nothing to reinterpret, nothing to turn against you. When you stop reacting, you're not just ending a conversation. You're removing the entire structure they rely on to maintain control. And that's what makes it so unsettling for them. They are used to patterns, to predictable emotional responses they can trigger whenever they want. They know which words will provoke you, which actions will get a reaction, which moments will pull you back in. But when those reactions suddenly disappear, it creates a kind of psychological void they don't know how to fill. They may try harder at first, pushing more buttons, escalating their behavior, testing your limits in ways that used to work. But now the outcome is different. The energy they expect simply isn't there. What makes silence so powerful is that it cannot be manipulated in the same way words can. When you speak, you give them material. You give them something to analyze, distort, and use to their advantage. Even your honesty can be turned into a weakness in their hands. But silence denies them that opportunity completely. It forces them into a position they're not comfortable with, one where they have no clear control over the narrative. They can't predict your next move because there is no visible move. They can't argue against your silence because it doesn't present an argument. And most importantly, they can't extract emotional supply from something that gives nothing back. This is where the silent discard truly begins, not in a dramatic exit, but in the quiet refusal to participate the way you once did. You're still present, at least for now, but your presence feels different. It's calmer, more distant, less reactive. You're no longer trying to fix misunderstandings or prove your intentions. You're no longer chasing clarity in conversations that only lead to more confusion. Instead, you're observing, stepping back, and allowing the silence to speak for you. And in that silence, something important happens. You start to regain control over yourself. For the narcissist, this shift is deeply uncomfortable. They may interpret your silence in different ways at first. They might think you're upset or trying to punish them or playing some kind of game. But as it continues, as it becomes consistent, they begin to realize that this isn't temporary. This isn't a tactic you're using to get a reaction from them. It's the absence of a reaction altogether. And that realization creates tension, because it signals a loss of influence they can't easily reverse. They may try to break the silence by provoking you, saying things they know would have affected you before. They may attempt to pull you back into old dynamics where your emotions were more accessible, more visible, more controllable. But now those attempts start to fail, not because you don't feel anything, but because you've chosen not to express it in a way that gives them power over you. And that choice changes everything. Silence, in this context, is not about shutting down or disconnecting from your emotions. It's about refusing to offer those emotions to someone who has consistently misused them. It's about recognizing that not every situation deserves a response, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is step back and say nothing at all. Because in that nothing, there is clarity, there is control, and there is a quiet strength that doesn't need to prove itself through words. This is the point where the dynamic begins to unravel in a way that can't be easily repaired. The patterns that once held everything together start to break down, because one side is no longer participating in the same way. And without that participation, without that constant flow of emotional energy, the connection loses its foundation. It may not end immediately, and it may not be obvious to others, but internally something has already changed. The silence has created distance, and that distance continues to grow. And that's why this stage matters so much, because it marks the transition from being emotionally controlled to becoming emotionally independent. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, but it's incredibly powerful. It's the moment you stop feeding the cycle, and in doing so, you begin to step out of it completely. There's a point in this silent shift where something deeper begins to happen, something the narcissist is completely unprepared for. Up until now, their sense of control has always felt solid, almost unquestionable. They believed they understood you, knew how to trigger you, how to pull you closer, how to push you away, and most importantly, how to keep you emotionally engaged. That sense of dominance didn't come from real strength, though it came from consistency. Your reactions were predictable, your emotions were accessible, your presence was reliable. And over time, they built an identity around that control, mistaking your emotional availability for their own power. But the moment your responses begin to fade, that entire structure starts to weaken in ways they can't ignore. At first, it's subtle. They notice a delay in your reactions, a change in your tone, a lack of intensity where there used to be emotion. Conversations that once felt charged now feel flat, almost distant. The things that used to provoke you no longer have the same effect, and that alone creates a kind of confusion they're not used to dealing with. They may brush it off initially, assuming it's temporary, assuming you'll return to the version of yourself they're familiar with. But as the pattern continues, as your silence becomes more consistent and your emotional presence less accessible, something begins to crack beneath the surface. The illusion they've been relying on, the belief that they are in control, starts to fall apart. Without your emotional responses, they lose the very thing that reinforced their dominance. There's no reflection of their influence anymore, no proof that their words or actions still hold the same weight. And that absence forces them into a position they've been avoiding all along, self-questioning. For the first time, they begin to ask themselves things they don't have clear answers to. Why aren't you reacting the way you used to? Why does it feel like you're pulling away, even when you're still physically present? Do they still matter to you in the same way? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, have they already lost you without realizing it? These questions don't come from a place of self-awareness or growth. They come from discomfort, from the sudden loss of certainty, because their confidence was never truly internal. It wasn't built on self-understanding or emotional stability. It was built on external validation, on your attention, your reactions, your willingness to engage. You were the mirror that reflected their sense of importance back to them. And now that mirror is no longer responding in the same way, or in some moments, not at all. And without that reflection, they're left facing something unfamiliar: emptiness. This is where the collapse becomes more visible, not necessarily to others, but in the way they start to behave. They may become more persistent, trying to re-establish the connection in ways that feel forced or unnatural. They might test boundaries, say things designed to provoke a reaction, or revisit old patterns that used to work without fail. But now those attempts begin to fall flat. The responses they expect don't come, or when they do, they lack the emotional charge that once gave them meaning. And that's when the realization starts to sink in, slowly but steadily. The control they thought they had is no longer there. What makes this collapse so significant is that it happens in real time, often without any clear event marking the change. There's no single moment they can point to and say, this is where everything shifted. Instead, it's a gradual unraveling, a series of small, quiet moments where their influence continues to weaken. And the more they try to regain it, the more obvious it becomes that something fundamental has changed. The dynamic they once relied on no longer functions the same way because one side has stepped out of the pattern entirely. For you, this stage may feel calm, even freeing, but for them, it's deeply unsettling. They are used to being the one who dictates the emotional tone, the one who controls the pace and direction of the interaction. But now, that control has slipped away, and there's no clear way to get it back. And that's where the true nature of their confidence is exposed. It wasn't grounded or stable. It was conditional, dependent on your participation, your attention, your emotional energy. Without those things, it begins to crumble. And as it collapses, something important becomes clear. Their sense of power was never as strong as it seemed. It was sustained by your willingness to engage, to react, to stay connected even when it cost you something. But now, with that energy withdrawn, the illusion can't hold itself together anymore. It starts to break piece by piece, revealing what was underneath all along, a fragile structure built on dependency, not dominance. This is the turning point where the balance shifts in a way that can't easily be reversed. Not because you've done something dramatic, but because you've stopped doing what kept the dynamic alive. And in that absence, their false power begins to collapse, leaving them to face a reality they were never prepared to confront. There's a stage in this process that feels almost contradictory, and it's the part most people don't expect. You would think that when someone begins to pull away, especially quietly and without drama, the other person would simply move on or lose interest. But with a narcissist, the opposite often happens. Instead of detaching, they become more focused, more curious, and in many cases, completely consumed by what just changed. This is the obsession phase, and it doesn't come from love or genuine emotional connection. It comes from the sudden absence of control, combined with something even more unsettling for them, the lack of closure. Up until this point, they've been used to relationships ending in a very specific way. There's usually conflict, emotional intensity, arguments that go in circles, and a final moment where something is said, something is done, and the connection breaks in a way they can understand and, more importantly, reshape in their own mind. Even if things end badly, they still get an ending they can work with. They can blame, justify, rewrite the story, or position themselves however they need to in order to protect their image. But when an empath chooses silence instead of confrontation, that familiar ending never comes. There's no final argument to analyze, no emotional reaction to feed on, no clear moment they can point to and say, this is why it ended. And that's where the obsession begins. Because the human mind, especially one that relies on control and narrative, struggles with unfinished stories. When something ends without explanation, it creates a kind of mental loop. They start replaying conversations, looking for clues, trying to figure out what changed and when. They may go back to past interactions, analyzing your tone, your words, your behavior, searching for the moment where things started to shift. But the more they look, the less clarity they find. And that lack of clarity keeps them stuck, thinking about you far more than they expected to. What makes this even more intense is that your silence removes their ability to resolve it externally. They can't call you and get a reaction. They can't provoke you into an argument that would give them emotional release. They can't pull you back into a familiar pattern where everything, even the conflict, feels predictable. Instead, they're left alone with their thoughts, trying to make sense of something that doesn't follow their usual rules. And for someone who is used to controlling outcomes, that loss of control can feel overwhelming. They may try to reinsert themselves into your life in subtle or direct ways. A message that seems casual but is designed to test the waters. A sudden attempt to reconnect as if nothing ever changed, or even behavior that feels more intense than before as they try to regain your attention in any way they can. But what's really driving these actions isn't connection, it's the need to close the loop. They want a reaction, any reaction, because even a negative response would give them something solid to hold on to. Silence, on the other hand, gives them nothing, and that nothing becomes louder with time. This is the part that drives them the most unsettled. You didn't give them an ending. You didn't explain, argue, or break down in a way that made the situation clear. You simply withdrew emotionally and mentally without creating a scene. And because of that, they're left with a version of the story that feels incomplete. They don't know how you really feel now. They don't know if you've moved on completely or if there's still something left. They don't know if they've lost you for good or if this is just another phase. And that uncertainty keeps pulling their attention back to you again and again. For you, this phase might feel quiet, even distant as you continue to move forward internally. But for them, it's anything but quiet. It's a constant mental noise, a series of unanswered questions that don't seem to settle. And the more they try to understand it, the more it slips away from them. Because the answer isn't in something you said or did. It's in what you stopped giving, your energy, your reactions, your emotional presence. That's why this stage is so powerful. Not because it creates chaos on the outside, but because it creates tension on the inside where they can't easily escape it. You didn't fight for the last word. You didn't try to prove your point. You didn't give them a dramatic exit they could turn into a story that suits them. Instead, you gave them silence. And in that silence, there's no clear ending, no resolution, no control. And that's what makes it so difficult for them to let go. Because as long as the story feels unfinished, as long as there's no clean break they can define, a part of their attention stays attached. Not to you as a person, but to the unanswered question of what really happened. And that question lingers far longer than any argument ever could, creating a kind of obsession that doesn't fade easily, precisely because it was never given a proper end. When direct control slips away, it doesn't simply disappear, it changes form. This is where things often take a darker turn, not always in obvious ways, but in ways that are calculated and quietly damaging. When a narcissist realizes they can no longer reach you the way they used to, when your silence blocks their usual methods of influence, they begin to shift their focus outward. If they can't control you anymore, they will try to control how you are seen. This is the beginning of smear campaigns and desperate control tactics, and while it may look like confidence on the surface, it's actually driven by something much deeper: panic. The loss of your emotional response doesn't just remove their control over you, it also threatens the image they've built around themselves. In their version of reality, they are not the problem. They are the one who was misunderstood, mistreated, or unappreciated. And without your participation to reinforce or challenge that narrative, they feel the need to secure it elsewhere. So they begin to rewrite the story, carefully adjusting details, leaving out key moments, and presenting a version of events that places them in the best possible light. To others it may sound convincing, even believable, because it's often delivered with confidence and emotional intensity. But what's really happening is not truth being shared, it's control being redirected. They may start by planting small ideas in conversations, subtle comments that shape how others perceive you. They might describe you as distant, cold, or difficult, framing your silence as something negative rather than what it truly is, a boundary. They may exaggerate conflicts, twist your intentions, or present themselves as the one who tried everything while you simply changed. This isn't random behavior. It's a deliberate attempt to protect their image while also regaining a sense of power they feel slipping away. At the same time, they often take on the role of the victim. This is one of the most effective ways to regain sympathy and support from others. By presenting themselves as hurt, confused, or abandoned, they create a narrative where they are the one who suffered, and you are the one who caused it. This not only shifts attention away from their behavior, but also invites others to validate them, to reassure them, and in a way, to replace the emotional supply they lost from you. And that's a key part of this phase. They are actively seeking new sources of attention and validation to fill the gap your silence created. This is where new supply often comes into the picture. It could be new relationships, new friendships, or even increased attention on social platforms, anything that gives them a sense of relevance and control again. On the surface, it may look like they've moved on quickly, like your absence didn't affect them at all. But in reality, this behavior is reactive, not reflective. It's not about genuine connection. It's about replacing the energy they no longer receive from you. It's a way to stabilize themselves, to avoid sitting with the discomfort of losing control, and to prove both to themselves and others that they are still desired, still important, still in control. But if you look closely, there's a pattern beneath all of this. The urgency, the need to explain, the effort to shape perception, it all points to something fragile beneath the surface. Because if their sense of power were truly stable, it wouldn't need this level of reinforcement. It wouldn't depend on how others see you or how quickly they can replace your presence. The intensity of these actions reveals the truth. This isn't confidence, it's damage control. What makes this phase particularly difficult is that it can create confusion, especially if you hear about it indirectly. You may feel misunderstood, misrepresented, or even tempted to respond and correct the narrative. And that's exactly what these tactics are designed to provoke. A reaction, a break in your silence, a return to the dynamic where they can engage with you again. But the power of your position lies in consistency. The more you remain grounded in your decision not to engage, the less effective these tactics become over time. Because while they may influence how some people see you temporarily, they cannot sustain that narrative indefinitely without your participation. Eventually, the gap between what is said and what is real becomes more visible. People notice inconsistencies, patterns, and behaviors that don't align with the story being told. And without you feeding into the drama, without you reacting or defending yourself, the situation begins to settle in a different way, one that doesn't rely on their version of events. This stage is not about strength on their part, even though it may appear that way from a distance. It's not a sign that they've moved on or gained control again. It's a response to losing something they depended on, a way to cope with the sudden absence of influence. The need to control the narrative, to play the victim, to seek new sources of validation, it all comes from the same place. A place that feels unstable, uncertain, and unwilling to face that the dynamic has changed in a way they can't easily reverse. And that's the truth behind these tactics. They are not a display of power, but an attempt to recreate it, not a sign of confidence, but a reaction to its collapse. It may look controlled from the outside, but underneath, it's driven by something much less stable. It's panic, carefully disguised as control, trying to hold on to something that has already begun to slip away. There comes a stage in this journey where the focus quietly shifts away from them and settles fully on you, and this is where the real transformation begins. Up until now, so much of your energy may have been tied to understanding their behavior, responding to their actions, and trying to keep some kind of emotional balance in a situation that never truly felt stable. You explained yourself not because you were wrong, but because you wanted clarity. You chased resolution, not because you were weak, but because you believed things could improve. You tried to prove your intentions, your loyalty, your honesty, hoping that if you just said the right words or showed up the right way, something would finally change. But somewhere along the way, you realized that none of that was actually working. Not because you weren't doing enough, but because the dynamic itself was built in a way that kept you emotionally engaged without ever giving you real peace. And that realization is where everything starts to shift. Not loudly, not all at once, but in a steady internal way that changes how you see things. You begin to notice that you're no longer reacting the same way. The things that once pulled you into long explanations now feel unnecessary. The urge to defend yourself starts to fade, replaced by a quiet understanding that not everything needs to be corrected. You stop chasing conversations that only lead in circles, and you stop trying to fix what was never yours to fix. It's not that you don't care anymore, it's that you care differently. You care about your energy, your peace, your sense of self, in a way you didn't before. This is what moving from emotional participation to quiet power really looks like. You're still aware, still present, but no longer entangled in the same way. You're observing instead of absorbing. You're choosing your responses instead of reacting automatically. And most importantly, you're no longer giving access to parts of yourself that were once easily reached. That emotional availability that used to be constant, that willingness to engage no matter how draining it became, is no longer there in the same form. And that changes everything, because the dynamic depended on that access. What makes this transformation so powerful is that it doesn't rely on external validation. You're not waiting for them to understand you, to apologize, or to finally see things your way. You've stepped out of that need entirely. There's a kind of calm that comes with that, a sense of stability that isn't easily shaken by their behavior anymore. Where there used to be tension, there is now distance. Where there used to be confusion, there is now clarity. And that clarity allows you to see the situation for what it really is, without the emotional fog that once made everything harder to navigate. From the outside, this might look like you've become distant or even cold, but that's not what's really happening. You haven't lost your ability to feel, you've gained control over where and how those feelings are expressed. You're no longer giving your energy to a place where it isn't respected or returned in a healthy way. And that decision, quiet as it may be, is what makes you untouchable in this context. Not because you've built walls or shut down completely, but because you've become selective. You've learned that not every situation deserves your full emotional presence, and that understanding protects you in a way nothing else can. You didn't just leave them, you left the version of yourself they controlled. That's the core of this transformation. The version of you that felt responsible for fixing everything, that believed more effort would eventually lead to change, that stayed engaged even when it was draining, that version has shifted, not disappeared but evolved. You've taken back the parts of yourself that were once shaped by their expectations, their reactions, their patterns. And in doing so, you've redefined your role in the dynamic completely. This doesn't mean the process is always easy. There may still be moments where old habits try to pull you back, where you feel the urge to explain, to respond, to reconnect in familiar ways. But the difference now is awareness. You see those patterns for what they are, and that awareness gives you a choice. You're no longer operating on automatic responses. You're choosing what aligns with your peace, even if that choice is silence, distance, or simply stepping away. And that's what makes this stage so significant. Because it's not about them anymore. It's not about whether they change, understand, or come back. It's about you stepping into a version of yourself that is no longer defined by the dynamic you were once in. A version that doesn't need to prove its worth through constant effort, that doesn't seek validation in unstable places, and that doesn't lose itself trying to maintain something that was never balanced to begin with. This is quiet power in its purest form. It doesn't announce itself, it doesn't demand attention, and it doesn't need to be explained. It simply exists in the way you carry yourself, in the choices you make, and in the boundaries you no longer feel guilty for having. And once you reach this point, the connection that once held so much weight begins to lose its influence, not because it was forced away, but because you've outgrown the version of yourself that kept it alive. There is a final stage in this process that lands with a kind of quiet intensity, and it's the one the narcissist never truly prepares for. Throughout everything, the silence, the distance, the fading reactions, there's still an underlying belief they hold on to. A belief that eventually you will return, that something will pull you back, whether it's emotion, memory, or unfinished business. They expect a moment where you break your silence, where you reach out, where the connection reopens in a way they can recognize and regain control over. Because in their experience, patterns repeat, people come back. Emotional ties don't just disappear without leaving a door open, and for a long time they rely on that assumption to stay grounded even as things begin to shift. But this is where the real shock begins to take shape, not in something you say, but in what you don't do. Time passes and you don't come back. There's no message, no sudden explanation, no attempt to reconnect. The silence that once felt temporary now starts to feel permanent. And with that realization comes something they didn't expect to face, a complete lack of access to you, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally as well. You're no longer reacting, no longer engaging, no longer present in the way you used to be. And more than that, you're not even watching from a distance. You've moved on in a way that doesn't revolve around them at all. This is difficult for them to process, because it challenges one of their core assumptions, that they still matter to you in a way that can be reactivated. They may have believed that your silence was a phase, a temporary withdrawal that would eventually give way to emotion again. They may have told themselves that you were just taking space, that something would bring you back, that the connection still existed beneath the surface, waiting to be triggered. But as that moment never comes, as your absence becomes consistent and undeniable, that belief starts to break down. What makes this stage so powerful is not just that you've left, but how you've left. There was no dramatic ending, no explosive moment that marked a clear separation. Instead, there was a gradual withdrawal, a quiet detachment that didn't demand attention or closure. And because of that, they're left without a clear narrative to hold on to. They can't point to a specific event and say, "This is why it ended." They can't rewrite the story in a way that fully satisfies them, because the ending was never given to them in a form they could control. It simply unfolded steadily and silently until there was nothing left to engage with. You don't come back. You don't react. You don't even care anymore. That's the part that carries the most weight. Not because you've become indifferent in a cold or disconnected way, but because you've genuinely moved beyond the need to stay emotionally tied to something that no longer serves you. The care you once had was real, but it has shifted into something else, something that no longer pulls you back into the same dynamic. And that shift is what makes your absence feel so final. For the narcissist, this is where the reality sets in, often slowly, sometimes all at once. The idea that you might return fades with time, replaced by the understanding that the connection they relied on is no longer accessible. And that understanding can be deeply unsettling because it represents a loss they can't easily reverse or redefine. There's no conversation to reopen, no reaction to provoke, no emotional thread to pull on. The space you've created is complete, and it doesn't invite them back in. This is the moment where the silent discard reveals its full impact. It wasn't a strategy, it wasn't a phase, and it wasn't something you did to get a reaction. It was a genuine shift, a decision made internally that changed how you relate to them entirely. And once that shift reaches this point, it doesn't go backward. Not because it can't, but because there's no longer a reason for it to. You've seen the pattern, understood the dynamic, and stepped out of it in a way that doesn't depend on their response. From the outside, it may look simple, just distance, just silence, but underneath, it represents something much deeper. It represents closure that you created for yourself without needing their participation. It represents a kind of emotional independence that doesn't rely on answers, validation, or final conversations. And that's what makes it so final. Not the absence of communication, but the absence of need. And that's the ultimate shock. Not that you left, but that you stayed gone. Not that you became silent, but that your silence never broke. And in that unbroken silence, they're left to face a reality they didn't expect, that the connection they once controlled has ended in a way they cannot reach, cannot influence, and cannot bring back.